The rain pattered against the windows of Delmonico's, the fanciest restaurant in town. Inside, soft jazz played as diners in expensive suits and glittering dresses sipped cocktails and nibbled on appetizers. At the center of it all stood Frank Delmonico himself, owner, head chef, and local celebrity known for his exacting standards. Frank surveyed his domain with pride, nodding approvingly at the clink of fine china and the low murmur of satisfied customers. This was his life's work, a temple to culinary excellence where only the cream of society were welcome. He'd fought tooth and nail to make Delmonico's the most exclusive establishment around. The maitre d' approached, looking flustered. "Sir, we have a situation at the door." Frank's eyes narrowed. A situation could mean only one thing: someone undesirable trying to get in. He straightened his body and marched to the entrance, ready to defend his restaurant's reputation. As he rounded the corner, he saw them, a young black couple, dressed to the nines but clearly out of place among Delmonico's usual clientele. The woman wore a stunning red dress that hugged her curves, while the man cut a dashing figure in a tailored gray suit. They stood tall, exuding quiet confidence despite the hostile stares from other patrons. Frank felt his blood pressure rising. How dare they try to infiltrate his restaurant? Didn't they know their kind wasn't welcome here? He'd worked too hard to let them tarnish Delmonico's image. "I'm sorry," he said coldly, not bothering to hide his disdain. "We're fully booked tonight. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at one of the establishments downtown." The couple exchanged a look. "We have a reservation," the man said calmly, "under the name Johnson." Frank's lips curled into a sneer. "I'm afraid there must be some mistake. We don't have any reservations under that name." "Could you check again?" the woman asked, her voice steady despite the tension crackling in the air. "We made it weeks ago for our anniversary dinner." "Listen," Frank hissed, leaning in close. "I don't know how you got past the door, but Delmonico's has certain standards to uphold. We cater to a particular clientele, and you two simply don't fit the bill. Now I suggest you leave before I'm forced to call security." A hush fell over the nearby tables as other diners tuned in to the drama unfolding. Frank could feel their eyes on him, knew they were counting on him to handle this problem swiftly. The man in the gray suit stood his ground, meeting Frank's gaze evenly. "And what exactly about us doesn't fit your standards, Mr. Delmonico?" Frank sputtered, caught off guard by the direct challenge. "Well, that is to say, look, this is a high-class establishment. Our guests expect a certain atmosphere, you understand. Your presence here would make them uncomfortable." "I see," the woman said, her voice dripping with barely contained anger. "And I suppose it has nothing to do with the color of our skin." A few gasps echoed from the tables closest to them. Frank felt sweat beading on his forehead as he realized this confrontation was spiraling out of his control. "Now see here," he blustered, desperately trying to regain the upper hand. "I won't stand here and be accused of racism," the man supplied helpfully. "Because that's exactly what this is, Mr. Delmonico. Blatant, unapologetic racism." Frank's face flushed crimson. "How dare you? I'll have you know some of my best friends are, well, that is to say, oh, for heaven's sake, just get out. You're making a scene." The woman's eyes flashed dangerously. "Oh, we're making a scene. I think you're the one putting on quite a show here, Mr. Delmonico. Tell me, do you always treat potential investors this way?" Frank froze, the blood draining from his face. Investors?" The man nodded gravely. "Michael and Olivia Johnson. We represent a restaurant investment group that's been looking to expand into this area. We heard great things about Delmonico's and wanted to experience it for ourselves before making any decisions." But, Frank stammered, his mind reeling as he tried to process this new information. Olivia's voice was cold as ice. "We always like to visit establishments incognito first. Gives us a true sense of the atmosphere and how management treats all their customers. I must say, Mr. Delmonico, you've certainly given us an illuminating experience tonight." The weight of what he'd done came crashing down on Frank. He just torpedoed a potential multi-million-dollar deal, all because of his own prejudice. His carefully cultivated reputation was about to go up in flames. "Now wait just a minute," he pleaded, his tone suddenly obsequious. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. Of course, you're welcome here. Let me show you to our finest table. Champagne on the house." But Michael and Olivia were already turning to leave, their backs straight and heads held high. "I think we've seen quite enough," Michael said. "We'll be taking our business elsewhere. And don't worry, we'll be sure to let everyone in our extensive network know exactly how Delmonico's treats its guests." As they walked out, a smattering of applause broke out from some of the other diners. Frank stood rooted to the spot, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water as he watched his dreams crumble before his eyes. In the stuffy silence that followed, a voice piped up from one of the tables. "Hey Frank, how about you seat us downtown folk at that fancy table instead?" More laughter rippled through the dining room as Frank's humiliation was complete. He wanted Delmonico's to be the talk of the town, but not like this. Never like this. As murmurs of discontent spread among the remaining patrons, Frank knew his troubles were only beginning. He built his restaurant on a foundation of exclusivity and prejudice, and now those very pillars were crumbling beneath him. What would become of Delmonico's now? Could he salvage his reputation, or was this the beginning of the end? As Frank retreated to his office, head spinning, he knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. Frank slumped in his office chair, loosening his body with trembling fingers. The sounds of the bustling restaurant beyond his door seemed muffled and distant, as if he were underwater. How had everything gone so terribly wrong? He built Delmonico's from nothing, pouring his heart and soul into every detail. The gleaming mahogany bar, the crystal chandeliers, the meticulously curated wine list. All of it was meant to create an atmosphere of exclusivity and refinement. But now, in the harsh light of his actions, Frank was forced to confront an ugly truth. His vision of excellence had been tainted by prejudice all along. A soft knock interrupted his spiraling thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice hoarse. Sarah, his longtime hostess, poked her head in. Her usual cheerful demeanor was replaced by a look of concern. "Frank, we got a situation out here. Some of the regulars are asking questions, and there's a group at table 12 demanding to speak with you." Frank groaned, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Can't you handle it? I'm not feeling well." Sarah's expression hardened. "With all due respect, sir, I think you need to face this head-on. People saw what happened, and they're talking. If we don't address it quickly, things could get ugly." Reluctantly, Frank hauled himself to his feet. He knew Sarah was right, but the thought of facing his customers, of trying to explain away his inexcusable behavior, made him feel physically ill. As he stepped back into the dining room, a hush fell over the crowd. All eyes turned to him, a mix of curiosity, disappointment, and in some cases, thinly veiled anger. Frank cleared his throat, searching for words that wouldn't come. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice quavering. I owe you all an apology. My behavior earlier was racist." A voice called out from the back. "Disgraceful?" Frank flinched. Yes, he admitted, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. It was all of those things and more. "I've always prided myself on running a first-class establishment, but tonight I've shown myself to be anything but classy." A murmur ran through the crowd. Some nodded approvingly at his admission, while others still looked skeptical. "So what are you going to do about it?" Another diner challenged. "You can't just say sorry and expect everything to be fine." Frank nodded, feeling the weight of their expectations pressing down on him. "You're absolutely right. Words aren't enough. I need to take concrete action to make things right, not just for those I've wronged tonight, but for our entire community." As he spoke, Frank's mind raced. How could he possibly make amends for years of subtle and not so subtle discrimination? It wasn't just about tonight's incident. He knew in his heart that he'd been cultivating an atmosphere of exclusion for far too long. "Starting tomorrow," he announced, surprising even himself, "Delmonico's will be closed for renovations. When we reopen, it will be with a new mission, to be truly welcoming to all members of our community, regardless of race, background, or economic status." The room erupted in a mix of cheers, gasps, and heated discussions. Frank knew he'd just made a monumental decision, one that would upend everything he built. But for the first time that evening, he felt a glimmer of hope. As the night wore on and the last of the shell-shocked diners filed out, Frank found himself alone in the empty restaurant. He wandered from table to table, straightening chairs and smoothing tablecloths as he'd done countless times before. But now, every familiar surface seemed to mock him, reminding him of his failings. He paused by the front window, staring out at the rain-slicked street. Somewhere out there, Michael and Olivia Johnson were probably already spreading the word about their experience. Frank couldn't blame them. He deserved whatever consequences came his way. But as he stood there, lost in thought, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A figure huddled in the doorway across the street, seeking shelter from the rain. Without thinking, Frank grabbed an umbrella and hurried outside. "Hey there," he called softly, approaching the hunched form. "You look like you could use this more than me." The figure looked up, revealing the weathered face of an older man. His clothes were tattered and damp, his eyes wary. "You sure about that, mister? Most folks round here don't want nothing to do with the likes of me." Frank felt a pang of shame, knowing he would have been one of those people just hours ago. "Well, I'm not most folks," he said, holding out the umbrella, "and I'm trying to do better." The man studied him for a moment before accepting the offering with a nod of thanks. As Frank turned to go, a thought struck him. "Say, when was the last time you had a hot meal?" Minutes later, Frank found himself in Delmonico's kitchen, heating up leftover soup and buttering thick slices of fresh bread. The old man, who introduced himself as Joe, sat at the bar, looking around in wonder at the opulent surroundings. "Never thought I'd set foot in a place like this," Joe mused, sipping gratefully at a mug of steaming coffee. Frank set a steaming bowl in front of him. "Well, Joe, if I have anything to say about it, that's going to change. For you and for a lot of other people who've been shut out of places like Delmonico's for far too long." As Joe dug into his meal with gusto, Frank's mind began to whir with possibilities. Maybe this was the path to redemption, not just empty words or token gestures, but real, meaningful change. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the rain washed away to reveal a world of new possibilities. Frank arrived at Delmonico's early, his mind buzzing with ideas for the restaurant's transformation, but as he rounded the corner, he stopped short. A small crowd had gathered outside the restaurant, their faces a mix of curiosity and determination. At their center stood Michael and Olivia Johnson, looking as polished and confident as they had the night before. Frank's heart sank. Had they come to protest? To demand his resignation? He squared his shoulders, knowing he had to face whatever was coming. As he approached, Michael stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Delmonico," he said evenly, "we need to talk." Frank nodded, bracing himself for the worst. But as he unlocked the door and ushered the group inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation might just be the key to unlocking a better future, not just for Delmonico's, but for the entire community. Little did Frank know, the events about to unfold would challenge everything he thought he knew about himself, his business, and the true meaning of hospitality. As the door clicked shut behind them, the stage was set for a transformation that would ripple far beyond the walls of one restaurant, touching lives in ways none of them could have imagined. The tension in Delmonico's private dining room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Frank sat at the head of the table, his hands clasped tightly to hide their trembling. Across from him, Michael and Olivia Johnson wore expressions of cool professionalism, while the small group of community leaders they brought along watched the proceedings with keen interest. "Mr. Delmonico," Michael began, his voice level, "we've given a lot of thought to what transpired last night. While your actions were deeply concerning, we believe there may be an opportunity here for real, lasting change." Frank blinked in surprise. This wasn't the angry confrontation he'd been bracing for. "I'm listening," he said cautiously. Olivia leaned forward, her eyes intense. "We represent more than just an investment group. We're part of a larger initiative aimed at promoting diversity and inclusion in the restaurant industry. Your establishment, Mr. Delmonico, has long been a symbol of exclusivity in this town. We think it's time for that to change." As they laid out their proposal, Frank felt a mix of emotions washing over him. They wanted to work with him to transform Delmonico's into a model of inclusive fine dining, a place that maintained its standards of excellence while actively welcoming patrons from all walks of life. It was an ambitious plan, one that would require a complete overhaul of not just the restaurant's image, but its very philosophy. "This won't be easy," Michael warned. "You'll face pushback from some of your regular clientele. There will be skeptics who say you're only doing this to save face. Are you prepared for that kind of scrutiny?" Frank took a deep breath, thinking of Joe and the umbrella in the rain. I am, he said firmly. I know I have a lot to make up for, but I'm committed to doing whatever it takes. As the meeting wound down and plans began to take shape, Frank couldn't help but notice one of the community leaders, a young woman named Aisha, watching him with a guarded expression. When he caught her eye, she didn't look away. Is there something you'd like to add? Frank asked, genuinely curious. Aisha hesitated, then spoke. My grandmother worked in this kitchen for 20 years, she said quietly. She was the best sous chef you ever had, but you never once allowed her to set foot in the dining room. How do we know your change of heart is genuine? Frank felt the weight of her words like a physical blow. He remembered Aisha's grandmother, a talented chef whose innovations had contributed greatly to Delmonico's success. And yet, he kept her hidden away, never acknowledging her contributions publicly. I don't expect you to trust me right away, Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. But I hope that through my actions in the coming months, I can begin to earn that trust, from you, and from everyone else I've wronged over the years. As the group filed out, Frank's head was spinning. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose beyond simply turning a profit. Meanwhile, across town, word of the previous night's incident was spreading like wildfire. In the cozy kitchen of a small soul food restaurant, Evelyn Mama Washington listened to her grandson Marcus recount what he'd heard through the grapevine. Can you believe it, Mama? Marcus exclaimed. Old man Delmonico finally got called out for his racist bull. Watch your language, Mama chided gently, even as a smile played at the corners of her mouth. She'd had her own run-ins with Frank Delmonico over the years, and while she didn't wish ill on anyone, she couldn't help but feel a touch of satisfaction at the news. You think he'll actually change? Marcus asked skeptically. Mama shrugged, her hands never pausing as she kneaded dough for her famous sweet potato pie. People can surprise you, child. But change don't happen overnight. We'll just have to wait and see. Little did they know, their small restaurant was about to become an unexpected player in Delmonico's transformation. Back at Delmonico's, Frank stood in the empty dining room, surveying the space with new eyes. Every gilded mirror and crystal glass now seemed to reflect his own prejudices back at him. It was overwhelming, the magnitude of what he needed to change. A knock at the door startled him from his reverie. He opened it to find Sarah, his hostess, standing there with a determined look on her face. I heard about the meeting, she said without preamble. I want to help. Frank felt a rush of gratitude. I appreciate that, Sarah, but this isn't going to be easy. We're likely to lose business, at least in the short term. I can't guarantee. Sarah cut him off with a wave of her hand. With all due respect, sir, I've worked here for 10 years. I've seen how you've treated people, all kinds of people. If you're serious about making a change, then I want to be part of it. But, she added, her eyes narrowing, if this is just for show, I'll walk out that door and never look back. Her candor was refreshing, and Frank found himself nodding. No tricks, no show, he promised. I want to make this right, Sarah. I'm not entirely sure how. As they began to discuss ideas for moving forward, neither of them noticed the figure watching from across the street, Joe, the homeless man Frank had helped the night before. He stood in the shadows, a thoughtful expression on his weathered face, before turning and walking away with purpose in his step. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Frank threw himself into the renovation plans, working closely with Michael and Olivia to reshape Delmonico's from the ground up. They brought in consultants on diversity and inclusion, revamped the menu to incorporate a wider range of culinary traditions, and began reaching out to local community organizations. But not everyone was thrilled with the changes. As word spread of Delmonico's new direction, Frank began receiving angry calls and emails from some of his longtime patrons. They accused him of pandering, of destroying the restaurant's legacy. Each message stung, but Frank forced himself to read them all, to really hear the fear and resistance behind the angry words. One afternoon, as Frank was poring over resumes for new staff members, he received an unexpected visitor. Aisha, the young woman from the meeting, stood in his office doorway, her expression unreadable. I've been thinking about what you said, she began without preamble. About earning trust through actions, I have a proposal for you. As Aisha laid out her idea, Frank felt a glimmer of excitement. It was bold, potentially controversial, but exactly the kind of meaningful change they needed to make. But could he really pull it off? And how would the community react? As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows across Delmonico's papered-over windows, the stage was set for a transformation that would challenge not just Frank, but the entire community to confront long-held biases and reimagine what true hospitality could look like. The real test was yet to come, and the outcome was far from certain. The day of Delmonico's grand reopening dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions brewing inside Frank as he stood before the restaurant's gleaming facade. The past month had been a whirlwind of renovations, training, and community outreach. Now, as he straightened his tie and took a deep breath, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that everything hinged on the next few hours. Behind him, the newly diverse staff bustled about, making final preparations. Sarah, now promoted to manager, gave him an encouraging nod as she directed a group of servers. The new menu, a fusion of classic Delmonico's fare and dishes representing the city's multicultural heritage, was a point of pride and anxiety. As the clock ticked closer to opening time, a crowd began to gather outside. Frank's heart raced as he recognized faces both familiar and new. There were his old regulars, some looking skeptical, others curious. But there were also people he'd never seen before, young families, groups of friends from all walks of life, even a few people he recognized from the local shelter where he'd been volunteering. At the front of the crowd stood Michael and Olivia Johnson, their expressions unreadable. Beside them was Aisha, whose grandmother's recipes now featured prominently on the menu. Frank caught her eye, and she gave him a small, cautious smile. Just as Frank was about to unlock the doors, a commotion at the back of the crowd caught his attention. He squinted, trying to make out what was happening. His blood ran cold as he recognized Joe, the homeless man he'd helped that rainy night, being confronted by one of his former regular patrons. "This isn't the place for you," the patron was saying loudly, his face red with indignation. "Delmonico's used to mean something in this town. Now look at it, catering to your kind." Frank's first instinct was to rush over, to intervene before things got out of hand. But as he took a step forward, he felt a hand on his arm. It was Sarah. "Let the new Frank handle this," she said quietly. "Show them all what Delmonico's really stands for now." Swallowing hard, Frank nodded. He walked calmly towards the confrontation, aware that all eyes were on him. This was it, the moment of truth. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "Is there a problem here?" The patron turned to him, relief evident on his face. "Frank, thank goodness. This individual seems to think he can dine at Delmonico's. Surely you're not going to allow this." For a split second, Frank hesitated. He could feel the weight of expectations from all sides, his old clientele, the new community he was trying to embrace, his staff watching from the windows. The easiest thing would be to smooth things over, to find a diplomatic way to turn Joe away without causing a scene. Then he looked at Joe, really looked at him. He saw the dignity in the man's posture, the quiet determination in his eyes. And Frank knew what he had to do. "As a matter of fact," Frank said, his voice growing stronger with each word, "Joe here is my personal guest this evening. He'll be dining at my table, helping me evaluate our new menu." A collective gasp went up from the crowd. The patron sputtered in disbelief, while Joe's eyes widened in surprise. But this is outrageous," the patron spluttered. "What about your standards? Your reputation?" Frank met his gaze steadily. "My standards haven't changed, Richard. If anything, they've improved. Delmonico's has always been about excellence, in our food, in our service, and now in how we treat every single person who walks through our doors." He turned to address the entire crowd. "I know many of you have questions, concerns, maybe even doubts about the changes we've made. I understand. Change isn't easy, but I'm asking you to give us a chance. Come inside, try our new menu, meet our incredible staff, judge us not by who we exclude, but by how we make everyone feel welcome." As Frank finished speaking, a tense silence fell over the gathering. He held his breath, acutely aware that the future of Delmonico's, and his own journey of redemption, hung in the balance. Then, from somewhere in the back of the crowd, a single pair of hands began to clap. Slowly, others joined in. The applause grew, spreading through the onlookers like a wave. With hands that shook only slightly, Frank unlocked the doors to Delmonico's. "Welcome, everyone," he said, gesturing for Joe to enter first. "Let's begin a new chapter together." As the crowd began to file in, Frank caught sight of Michael and Olivia. They nodded approvingly, but their expressions remained guarded. He knew the real test was still to come. Inside, the renovated dining room buzzed with energy. The new decor struck a balance between Delmonico's classic elegance and a more inclusive, welcoming atmosphere. Frank watched nervously as diners were seated, menus distributed, and the first orders began to come in. In the kitchen, tensions ran high. The new head chef, a brilliant young woman named Zara who'd worked her way up from food trucks, barked orders with the intensity of a general leading troops into battle. Frank poked his head in, catching her eye. "How are we doing?" he asked, trying to keep the anxiety out of his voice. Zara gave him a fierce grin. "We're about to show this town what real fusion cuisine tastes like, Mr. D. Just you wait." As the evening progressed, Frank found himself pulled in a dozen different directions. He moved from table to table, greeting old friends and making new ones, smoothing over small hiccups and beaming with pride at every compliment to the food or service. But even as he basked in the generally positive atmosphere, Frank couldn't shake a nagging sense of unease. He noticed a few of his old regulars huddled together, speaking in low, urgent tones. And there was something about the way Michael and Olivia were scrutinizing everything that made him wonder if they were truly satisfied with the changes. Just as the dinner service was hitting its stride, Sarah appeared at Frank's elbow, her face pale. "We have a situation," she whispered urgently. "You need to come to the kitchen. Now." Frank's heart sank as he followed her through the swinging doors. Whatever was waiting for him in that kitchen, he knew it had the power to undo everything they'd worked so hard to achieve. As he pushed through the doors, the cacophony of the busy kitchen gave way to an eerie silence. Every eye turned to him, and Frank steeled himself for whatever challenge lay ahead. Frank's eyes darted around the kitchen, taking in the tense scene before him. Zara stood at the center, her chef's white splattered with sauce, her face a mask of fury. Beside her, one of the new line cooks, a young man Frank had hired from a local culinary program, looked on the verge of tears. "What's going on here?" Frank asked, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. Zara thrust a piece of paper at him. "Read this," she spat. "Found it taped to the back of the new hire's station." Frank's hands trembled as he unfolded the note. His blood ran cold as he read the hateful words scrawled across the page, racial slurs, threats, and a clear message. "Get out before we make you." "I swear, Mr. Delmonico, I didn't write this," the young cook pleaded, his voice cracking. "I would never." Frank held up a hand, silencing him. "I believe you, Carlos. This is not your handwriting." He'd seen enough order tickets to recognize the scrawl of one of his longtime kitchen staff. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The sabotage was coming from inside Delmonico's itself. Just then, Sarah burst back through the doors, her face ashen. "Frank, you need to get out there. Now." Heart pounding, Frank made his way back to the dining room, only to stop short at the threshold. The once lively atmosphere had turned tense and chaotic. At the center of it all stood Richard, the patron who had confronted Joe earlier, now red-faced and shouting. "This is what happens when you let their kind in here," he bellowed, gesturing wildly at a table where a family of color sat, looking mortified. "My soup was stone cold. My steak might as well have been shoe leather. This isn't the Delmonicos we know and love." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Frank could see the doubt creeping into people's eyes, the old prejudices rearing their ugly heads. Everything they'd worked for was unraveling before his eyes. In that moment, Frank felt a presence beside him. It was Joe, the man he'd invited as his personal guest. "Looks like you could use some help, friend," Joe said quietly. Before Frank could respond, Joe stepped forward, his voice cutting through the din. "Folks, if I could have your attention for a moment." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to the unlikely figure at the front of the restaurant. Joe stood tall, his weathered face serene despite the tension around him. "I've been watching all evening," Joe began, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Watching how this man," he gestured to Frank, "has been bending over backward to make everyone feel welcome. Rich or poor, black or white, it didn't matter. And let me tell you something, in all my years on these streets, I've never seen anything like it." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Now, I may not know much about fancy dining, but I know a thing or two about people. And what I see here tonight is fear. Fear of change, fear of the unfamiliar. But let me ask you this, isn't that fear exactly what's been keeping us divided all these years?" A hush fell over the room as Joe's words struck home. Even Richard seemed to deflate, the anger draining from his face. "So how about we all take a deep breath," Joe continued, "and give this new Delmonico's a real chance? Because from where I'm standing, this might just be the start of something beautiful." As Joe finished speaking, a slow applause began to build. Frank felt a surge of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could turn this around. But the moment was shattered by a crash from the kitchen, followed by a scream. Frank spun around to see smoke billowing from behind the swinging doors. "Fire!" someone yelled, and panic erupted. In the chaos that followed, Frank's mind raced. This was no accident. Someone was trying to destroy everything he'd built, everything he was trying to become. But who? And more importantly, how could he stop it before it was too late? As guests rushed for the exits and staff scrambled to contain the blaze, Frank caught sight of Michael and Olivia. Their expressions were unreadable as they surveyed the scene. Were they disappointed? Angry? Or was there something else going on? Amidst the smoke and confusion, Frank made a split-second decision. He grabbed a fire extinguisher and charged towards the kitchen. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let Delmonico's go down without a fight. As he pushed through the swinging doors, coughing in the thickening smoke, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that this fire was more than just a physical threat. It was a crucible, a test at everything he claimed to stand for. And as he faced the flames, he knew that the real battle, for the soul of Delmonico's and for his own redemption, was only just beginning. Behind him, unnoticed in the chaos, a figure slipped out the back door, a satisfied smirk playing across their face. The night was far from over, and the true architect of Delmonico's potential downfall had only just begun to show their hand. Smoke billowed through Delmonico's as Frank battled the flames in the kitchen. With the help of quick-thinking staff and a few brave patrons, they managed to contain the fire before it could spread further. As the last wisps of smoke cleared, Frank surveyed the damage with a heavy heart. The kitchen was a mess, but miraculously, the dining room had been spared. Outside, sirens wailed as fire trucks and police cars converged on the scene. Frank stepped out into the cool night air, his face smudged with soot, to find a crowd gathered on the street. Among them were his staff, shaken but unharmed, and many of the evening's patrons, including Joe, who gave him a reassuring nod. As Frank began to explain the situation to the fire marshal, a commotion near the back of the crowd caught his attention. Two police officers were escorting someone towards a patrol car, and with a jolt, Frank recognized the figure. It was Thomas, one of his longest-serving kitchen staff. "Wait," Frank called out, pushing through the crowd. "Thomas? What's going on?" The officers stopped, and Thomas looked up, his face a mask of defiance and shame. "I'm sorry, Mr. Delmonico," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't let you destroy everything we built." Frank felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. You started the fire?" Thomas nodded slowly. "And the note? And I messed with some of the orders. I thought if tonight was a disaster, you'd see that all this change was a mistake." As the officers led Thomas away, Frank stood rooted to the spot, struggling to process this betrayal. He'd known there would be resistance to the changes at Delmonico's, but he never imagined it would go this far. A hand on his shoulder startled him out of his thoughts. It was Michael Johnson, with Olivia close behind. "Mr. Delmonico," Michael said, his voice grave. "I think it's time we had a talk." Frank's heart sank. After everything that had happened, he was sure the Johnsons would want to pull their support. But as they led him to a quiet corner, away from the chaos, their expressions softened. "What we saw tonight," Olivia began, "was more than just a restaurant facing adversity. We saw a community coming together. We saw real leadership in the face of crisis." Michael nodded in agreement. "You've proven that you're serious about making Delmonico's a place of true inclusivity, Mr. Delmonico, and we want to help you take it even further." Frank blinked in surprise. You too?" "We do," Olivia confirmed. But we have one condition. We want you to partner with Mama Washington's Soul Food Kitchen. Frank's confusion must have shown on his face because Michael quickly explained. Evelyn Washington has been a pillar of this community for decades. Her restaurant has been struggling lately, but her food is legendary. We think a partnership between Delmonico's and Mama's could be transformative for both businesses, and for this whole neighborhood. As the implications of this proposal sank in, Frank felt a surge of excitement. He remembered Mama Washington's grandson, Marcus, and the skepticism in his voice when discussing Delmonico's changes. This could be a chance to bridge that gap, to create something truly special. I'd be honored, Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. But why, after everything that's happened tonight? Olivia smiled. Because tonight showed us that Delmonico's isn't just about fancy food and high prices anymore. It's about bringing people together, about challenging old prejudices and creating new connections. That's the kind of investment we want to be part of. As they shook hands, sealing the deal, Frank felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Aisha standing there, a determined look in her eyes. I heard what happened, she said. And I want you to know I'm in. All the way, my grandmother's recipes, my connections in the community, whatever it takes to make this work. Frank felt a lump in his throat as he looked around at the unlikely group gathered around him, Michael and Olivia, the savvy investors, Aisha, representing a new generation of culinary talent, and in the distance Joe, chatting animatedly with some of Delmonico's regulars. Just then, Sarah approached, a phone in her hand. Frank, she said, her eyes wide. You're going to want to see this. She held out the phone, open to a local news website. The headline made Frank's jaw drop. Delmonico's fire ignites community spirit. Viral video shows diverse crowd uniting to save historic restaurant. Below was a video, already racking up thousands of views, showing the scene from earlier, staff and patrons of all backgrounds working together to evacuate the restaurant and help contain the fire. Comments poured in, praising Delmonico's new direction and calling it the symbol of positive change in the community. As Frank watched the video, he felt a swell of emotion. The night had been a roller coaster of highs and lows, of betrayal and unexpected alliances. But standing there, surrounded by this diverse group of supporters, he knew that Delmonico's, and he himself, had been forged anew in the flames of adversity. Well, Frank said, a smile spreading across his face despite the exhaustion of the night, it looks like we have some work to do. Who's ready to build something truly extraordinary? As a chorus of enthusiastic responses rang out, Frank couldn't help but marvel at the twists and turns that had led to this moment. Delmonico's was about to embark on a new chapter, one that promised to be more challenging, more rewarding, and more transformative than anything he could have imagined. And as the first light of dawn began to break over the city, Frank knew that this was just the beginning of an incredible journey, not just for Delmonico's, but for an entire community ready to come together and create change, one meal at a time. In the weeks that followed the eventful reopening night, Delmonico's underwent a transformation that went far beyond its menu and decor. The restaurant became a symbol of unity and progress in a community that had long been divided by invisible lines of race and class. Frank threw himself into the partnership with Mama Washington's Soul Food Kitchen with a passion that surprised even himself. The first time he walked into Mama's tiny, bustling restaurant, the aroma of cornbread and collard greens brought tears to his eyes. He realized how much he'd been missing by closing himself off to different culinary traditions. Mama Washington, a formidable woman with a booming laugh and a heart of gold, took Frank under her wing. You got a lot to learn, child, she told him on that first day, her eyes twinkling with amusement. But I reckon you're ready to listen now. Together, they crafted a menu that honored both Delmonico's legacy of fine dining and the soul-satisfying comfort food that had made Mama's Kitchen a neighborhood institution. The fusion was magic. Classic French techniques applied to Southern staples, soul food elevated with a gourmet twist. Aisha proved to be the perfect bridge between the two culinary worlds. Her grandmother's recipes, passed down through generations, found new life in Delmonico's kitchen. She worked tirelessly alongside Zara, the two young chefs pushing each other to new heights of creativity. The partnership extended beyond the kitchen. Frank and Mama Washington started a mentorship program, bringing in aspiring chefs from underserved communities to learn the ropes in both restaurants. The program quickly gained attention, with local schools and community centers clamoring to get involved. Joe, the homeless man whose wisdom had helped turn the tide on that chaotic opening night, became a fixture at Delmonico's. Frank offered him a job as a greeter, and his warmth and genuine interest in every guest's story made him an instant hit. Many regulars would specifically request to be seated in Joe's section, drawn by his philosophy and gentle humor. As for Thomas, the employee who had tried to sabotage the reopening, Frank made the difficult decision to press charges. But he also visited Thomas in jail, trying to understand what had driven him to such desperate acts. Those conversations were painful but enlightening, forcing Frank to confront the ways his own past behavior had fostered an environment where such prejudice could thrive. The viral video of Delmonico's fiery reopening night continued to circulate, drawing attention from far beyond their little corner of the city. Food critics and travel writers descended on the restaurant, eager to see if the hype was real. They left raving not just about the innovative cuisine, but about the palpable sense of community that permeated every aspect of the dining experience. One crisp autumn evening, about 6 months after the reopening, Frank stood in the center of Delmonico's dining room, surveying the scene with a sense of quiet pride. The restaurant was buzzing with energy, every table filled with a diverse mix of patrons. At one table, a group of executives in expensive suits clinked glasses with a family celebrating their son's college acceptance. At another, a young couple on their first date shyly shared a slice of Mama Washington's famous peach cobbler. In the corner, Michael and Olivia Johnson were hosting a group of potential investors, gesturing animatedly as they described the impact Delmonico's transformation had had on the broader community. Frank caught Olivia's eye, and she gave him a subtle thumbs up. As he made his way through the dining room, stopping to chat with guests and check in with his staff, Frank reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The road hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks and moments of doubt, times when the weight of expectations, both his own and others, had felt overwhelming. But with each challenge, the Delmonico's family had grown stronger. Frank had learned to lean on his team, to trust in the wisdom and experiences of those around him. He discovered that true leadership wasn't about having all the answers, but about creating an environment where everyone felt empowered to contribute their best. The partnership with Mama Washington's had blossomed in ways none of them could have predicted. What started as a business arrangement had grown into a true friendship, with Frank and Mama often found swapping stories and recipes long after closing time. Their collaboration had inspired other businesses in the area to seek out similar partnerships, creating a network of support that was revitalizing the entire neighborhood. As the night wound down and the last guests departed, Frank gathered his staff for their nightly debrief. It had become a tradition, a moment to reflect on the day's successes and challenges, to share ideas and support one another. "Great work tonight, everyone," Frank began, his voice warm with pride. "I know we had a few hiccups in the kitchen, but the way you all pulled together to make it work was incredible." Zara, her chef's coat still pristine despite the busy night, spoke up. "It's all about communication and respect," she said. "We built something special here, and we all want to protect it." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. Frank looked around at the faces of his team, some he'd known for years, others who joined in recent months. Each one brought something unique and valuable to Delmonico's. "I want to thank you all," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for your hard work, but for your faith. For believing that we could be more than what we were, that we could create something truly meaningful here." As the staff filed out, energized despite the late hour, Frank found himself alone in the dining room. He ran his hand along the smooth surface of a nearby table, marveling at how much had changed in such a short time. A soft knock at the door interrupted his reverie. It was Joe, ready to head home for the night. "Everything all right, boss?" he asked, noticing Frank's contemplative mood. Frank smiled. "More than all right, Joe. I was just thinking about how far we've come, and how much further we still have to go." Joe nodded sagely. "That's the beauty of it, isn't it? There's always room to grow, to learn, to do better. As long as we keep our hearts and minds open, there's no limit to what we can achieve." As they stepped out into the cool night air, Frank took one last look at the Delmonico's sign. It had been updated, the elegant script now accompanied by a simple tagline, where tradition meets innovation and everyone is welcome. Frank felt a sense of peace wash over him. He knew there would be more challenges ahead, more opportunities to learn and grow. But he also knew that he wasn't facing them alone. Delmonico's had become more than just a restaurant. It was a community, a family, a beacon of what was possible when people came together across the lines that too often divided them. As he turned to walk home, Frank's step was light. Tomorrow would bring new guests, new flavors, new stories to be shared over carefully prepared meals, and he couldn't wait to see what they would create together. The story of Delmonico's transformation had started with a moment of confrontation and prejudice, but it had grown into something far greater, a testament to the power of change, of second chances, and of the unifying force of good food shared among friends. In the end, it wasn't just about changing a restaurant. It was about changing hearts and minds, one meal at a time. And as the lights of Delmonico's flickered out, casting a warm glow on the quiet street, the promise of a new day, filled with possibility, understanding, and delicious discoveries, hung in the air like the lingering aroma of a perfect meal.